This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite folklore, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter. This week, we're talking with Briana N Cox and Kailee Pedersen about queer and BIPOC horror. Kailee Pedersen writes haunted, unsettling speculative fiction. She graduated with a BA in Classics from Columbia University, specializing in ancient Greek. Kailee was adopted from Nanning, China, and grew up in Nebraska, where her family owns a farm. She's the author of the queer poetry book Pastoral. Her novel Sacrificial Animals was a finalist for Best Horror at the 2025 Libby Book Awards, was named one of the New York Public Library's Best Books of 2024, and appeared on several other Best of lists, including Barnes & Noble, Esquire, Paste Magazine, Vulture, and the New York Times. When not scribbling down her next book, you can catch her studying opera performance at the Mozarteum University, playing video games, or working as a software engineer in New York City. Briana N Cox, she, they, is the oldest of 7 children and a first-generation academic. She holds a BA in Cognitive Science from Swarthmore College and an MS in Speech-Language Pathology from Purdue University. Briana has been a writing fellow through the Tennessee Playwright Studio, Stowe Story Labs, Ben Base Camp Feature Lab, Stage 32 Feature Competition, and the Moonshot Initiative Feature Accelerator. She won Best Script at the San Francisco Independent Film Festival and Best Tennessee Writer at the Nashville Film Festival. They've been highlighted in Variety Magazine and made the 2024 Next list of screenwriters to watch out for. Briana writes genre stories from the margins, illuminating the experiences of overlooked demographics with authenticity, dignity, and dark humor. Kailee and Briana, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having us. It's a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.
Kailee and Briana, how did you guys meet?
We met an amount of years ago that I will not state on this podcast at a thing called Young Arts for talented high schoolers in the arts. And we were in the writing section. And we spent a week in Florida together and kept in touch. And that year, which was, of course, quite recently, we stayed friends. And when I saw that Briana's book was coming out, I was so excited for them. And I thought maybe it would be a great opportunity for us to co-promote our books together. And since we both have not only connections as being queer BIPOC authors, but an interest in that discourse and talking about it on podcasts and sharing our thoughts and views and perspectives with others, that like co-guesting could be something fun for us.
Yeah, we both just wound up writing some very spooky things just off on our own. So it wound up being very convenient kind of get together and talk about that overlap between both of our works that was coming out at the same time.
That is awesome. You guys go back so recently, I guess I should say.
Only a couple years plus like 10, you know?
Yeah. Just
undisclosed amount of time.
Give or take 10 years. You guys suggested a panel discussion on queer and BIPOC horror and how it intersects with horror.
So the basic definition, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So just an umbrella category for anyone who is otherized or racialized under white supremacist systems, essentially. And then queer is also an umbrella category for both like gender and sexuality and like people under those expansive labels. So like gay and lesbian and non-binary and trans and all of these other labels for anyone who doesn't fall under like cis heteronormativity standards, essentially. And Kailee, how does that intersect with horror?
Well, I think you can approach it from a couple different angles. I think the really obvious one is when the author themselves has a queer and BIPOC identity. I think this can manifest really strongly when they write horror, because there are fears or experiences that I think are kind of unique to our communities. Just in terms of like what we fear or our anxieties, just like how women might have more fears about walking alone at night than maybe the average man might have. For us people of color, there may be fears about like, just giving an example, like institutional violence, police violence, racial violence that maybe a white person doesn't think about so much. And then I think there's also a way of approaching it when you read horror with queer and BIPOC characters, even if the author is not of that identity, you can see the ways in which they're treated within the text. Sometimes these characters might be represented in ways that are very interesting, that maybe betray a little bit about human anxiety or social anxiety at the time the book was written. I personally read Dracula as sort of reflecting a lot of the anti-Semitism of the era. Although we may not consider like Jewishness, I am Jewish myself, to be like a queer or BIPOC identity. It is like a marginalized identity. And so in those cases, and then again, there's been a lot of talk about like Lovecraft, how he depicts people of color as these inhuman creatures who are like infesting New York City. These are also ways in which queer and people of color are present in horror works, maybe not so positive ways, but even by being there, our manifestation lends some kind of different shading to the procedure and to what is happening.
Has it always been a lens that you have viewed these things like Dracula through, or did you, go from Goosebumps and then slowly develop this awareness?
I think for me, I tend to be very open when it comes to genre. I don't necessarily see myself as just a purely horror author. I love horror, and I'm so glad I've written a horror novel, and I would love to continue in the genre, but I also, want to be open to whatever impulses come to me. So my next book might be, my next book is a Western, and the one after, I don't know, might be sci-fi, so who knows? But I always think there's something, for me, very compelling and fascinating about dynamics of like humiliation, violence, agency, and that I think becomes very palpable and intense emotionally within the horror genre. So I come from more maybe like a film opera background than so much like reading a lot of horror books, and we can get into this when we do recommendations. But for me, I think first came to horror with like The Silence of the Lambs, which has itself a very controversial storyline involving a Buffalo Bill who may or may not be a trans representation, or may or may not be kind of a negative representation of what possibly might be considered to be a trans person, or it's sort of what would I say, like twisted through this lens of maybe ignorance at the time in the 1990s about what they were writing about, and these other things that are like very complicated about that topic, especially for me to discuss or tease out. And so seeing this very othered character who may or may not be interpreted as queer, I think was like kind of confusing for me at the time. I first watched the movie as a child, and then eventually I moved into reading, like, of course, critique about how they handled that aspect of the storyline, and critique from trans writers about how to handle like trans horror, and then reading more like authenticity into my kind of perspective. So there was some of that there early on for me, but I think I've always just like tried to understand and accept the works as they come, but understanding that they were positioned within a certain social system at the time, and certain social values and mores that do come out in the work. And I think that happens with Dracula, where I don't think Bram Stoker was really trying to write anything explicitly anti-Semitic, but there are elements where I think you can do a reading of Dracula where there's his desire, thirst for Christian blood is like very problematic, or very like it speaks to the fears or anxieties that they may have had at the time. Sorry, Briana, feel free. I didn't mean to ramble.
Oh no, that gave me time to think about my answer more as well. So I'm not just saying all the same stuff. But I think that is a very interesting question, because like for such a long time, marginalized people have essentially just had to see themselves in media that was not intentionally made with them as a target audience, or intentionally made for them to see themselves in it, or made by people like them. So the idea that like I liked horror as a marginalized person, even if the horror itself wasn't intended to be something for me to see myself in, I think is a very, very common thing that very many like queer or racialized people deal with. So I was literally looking up a few books. So there's Piccolo is Black is one that I really like, where it's talking about how specifically African Americans have just like claimed certain speculative fiction characters, like Piccolo from Dragon Ball being like the big one. There's like, I see myself in this character. It was not intended at all, but like it vibes with me, it vibes with my experience. Another one is It Came from the Closet, which is specifically about like horror, and a bunch of like horror, like writers or just horror creators in general writing essays on how they like came to their own queerness through horror media that was not intended to be that at all, like 90% of the time. So I think there's something that a lot of marginalized people are very familiar with, where like because we are simultaneously like otherized and kind of like victimized in that way, but also seen as someone who's like a powerful, scary thing, where we're simultaneously victimized and empowered in that way. People really see themselves in speculative fiction and horror specifically. So, like when I was younger, like horror itself had not really had as much of a boom as it has since like the 2010s. So, reading horror meant like you read Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe, and that was about it. So I really, really enjoy both of those authors, but it's definitely been a much more recent like occurrence that this genre I think has expanded beyond one very specific lens, and I'm very happy to see it.
Are there any that you would count among your early influences beyond King and Poe? Do you have any favorite books that still hold up?
Yeah, like Kailee, like Dracula is one of mine. I really, really enjoyed the format of that one when I was first introduced to it. I think that's the first like epistolary novel I ever read. So like, oh my God, you can do it that way? Cool. And just horror being much looser and more expansive in its formats, I found to be very like engaging as like a young person and like a child reading books I should not have been reading, but I was unsupervised in the library.
Yeah, same. I'm going to say Cormac McCarthy. He's not really usually shelved as horror, but I do think The Road is pretty scary. And then as a teenager, like Thomas Ligotti, Brian Evanson.
So, in your opinion, how has queer and BIPOC horror changed since you've been aware of it?
I think opening this conversation, I do want to point out that, Briana, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the last stats showed that 90% of books published by the major publishers, like the big five in America, are by white authors. So when we speak of queer BIPOC authors, we're already speaking of like a minority within that 10%. So even though right now we might talk about things getting better or there being more BIPOC and queer horror or things looking up or us being really excited for the future, I did want to share, and this isn't to be pessimistic, but just to indicate that we like have a long way to go, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I did kind of just on my own platform a breakdown of the most recent Goodreads awards, which I think is like a nice snapshot of at least what popular reading and like popular literacy looks like. And horror was the most diverse one in terms of like race and ability and gender. Like it was very, very diverse in what was nominated. And then what wound up winning was kind of like the least diverse one, which I think is a good snapshot of kind of what stuff is looking like. Where horror, I think, is very like it's open as a genre because it's already so niche. Like I don't think anyone who's writing horror is trying to write something that appeals to broader audiences for the most part. Where I think it gives like a playground to really like experiment and express ideas that you're not seeing in other genres that are trying to have broader appeal just by default. So I do like agree with Kailee that we should really emphasize that publishing in general has a lot of work to do still. But I have seen, especially like in the 2020s, like there's been like especially an indie scene for like an explosion in like queer and BIPOC and queer plus BIPOC horror. Like there's been so much good stuff coming out. It's just kind of independent from like larger publishing spheres a lot of the time, so it takes more digging.
I think from the world of trad, we see more horror being published. It is making, I think, buku bucks right now, which is great. I think we're even seeing imprints. My imprint, St. Martin's Press, is not really known for horror, but they do publish horror now. So I do think we're also seeing imprints that maybe would traditionally in the past publish like literary fiction or some other genres are starting to dip their toe into horror or into what I write, which is sort of like I would describe as literary speculative. So sort of a hybrid of literary fiction where you have this really elevated prose and text, but you have like, the scares, the gore and stuff as well. I also think from the film side, Briana, you're a screenwriter, so you probably have way more expertise. I'm just an average person that like pays way too much money for a medium popcorn and a medium soda that I don't finish whenever I go to the movies. I've seen in the movies too, I think in the film industry, I feel like we're seeing, like amazing filmmakers, like obviously Ryan Coogler with Sinners. There was like huge financial success there. I think we're seeing some great stuff from abroad. I wouldn't describe Parasite as horror, but I think it's a thriller, which is like adjacent enough. And of course, Asian horror has always had presence in international cinema, but I think we're really seeing it with like The Wailing, Japanese horror. Of course, Ring was like a seminal film, and that legacy has just continued. I don't know. Like, I feel like I'm missing something here, but wondering what you thought about like that in film too.
Yeah, from the like film and screenwriting perspective. So I largely work in like horror screenwriting as well. So my book writing is much more expansive into speculative fiction in general, but I'm pretty niche down into horror for screenwriting, where kind of similar to books, where it gives people a lot of space to play because the expectations for horror films are different for like quote unquote like bigger films. So they're not expected to cost as much money. They are expected to put butts in seats kind of no matter what. So a lot of like really cool and interesting ideas that wouldn't make it as like a drama can get greenlit as horror, because if something is scary and they release it during October, people are going to see it essentially. So it's considered to be like one of like the tentpole genres that's actually reliably making money. And it also reliably does not cost that much. So like first time filmmakers or people who are getting into film and like want to like get into directing but haven't done it yet, even if they've established themselves in other ways. A lot of the times work in horror films. Like that's what Jordan Peele did. Nia DaCosta also did that. She did the Candyman remake and is doing the next 28 years movie. I forget what it's called.
The Bone Temple, or is that
Bone
not the right
Temple.
thing?
So yeah.
Also Karen Kusama, right? The Invitation.
Yep, Karen Kusama is a good one. Yes, so horror, like specifically for movies, I think is an amazing space to like get more diverse people working within it, because it is considered safe in ways that a lot of the time like queer BIPOC creators are considered unsafe.
Forecasting a bit, looking at trends, where do you think that queer and BIPOC horror is going in the literary and film space?
I really hesitate. Sorry, keep going, Brianna.
Yes, sir. I'm like literally trying to look up a graph so you can go first.
Okay, if you have like data-based numbers, I can just YOLO Nostradamus over here, and then you can come in with like actual data. Gosh, I mean, I feel like it's kind of a basic thing to say, but I think hopefully we'll see more of this stuff in the future. I feel like there is like an appetite for it. And my vibe with publishing, at least trad, is that like when one book has success, they do want to see more of that from other books. So I'm hopeful that this kind of wave of queer and or BIPOC authors in horror will lead to diversification in the publishing industry, because just sort of they see that and they know that audiences want that. I think we might see more like hybrid genre stuff. I feel like Nope really inspired me to kind of consider the possibility of the Western. I don't know if you're seeing that as well, Brianna, but I feel like we're not just seeing like one type of horror written by queer and BIPOC folks, but like anything from slashers to what I would describe as maybe like soft horror that is not very gory, horror that is more psychological. There's also like cozy horror that people write. There's like cosmic horror. There's everything from like the stuff for the ultra gorehound splatterpunk to the more restrained, or also like stuff that's like more literary to more commercial. So I think we're really seeing like a lot of different voices and styles kind of mushrooming up right now.
I have found the graph. So like I am one of these people, I am probably a bad person to ask this of, because I am like a very big proponent of like independent art. It's like indie filmmaking and indie book stuff, just because I think those spaces are more expansive in a lot of ways and less gate kept. So the chart I was looking for was the UCLA diversity report from last year. And this is specifically looking at films, so not books, but books are relatively similar. The last time I looked, I cannot find that graph, but it was, let's see, 81 white male directors, 11 white women, 1 Black person, 5 Latina people, and 5 Asians. And that was it for all of 2024 when it came to movie directing. And that is a regression from 2023. And I think that is generally caused by just wider sociopolitical things. We're seeing kind of this rise in more conservatism in like our media and our marketing. So I'm not personally very optimistic about queer BIPOC art being elevated, at least not next year, maybe after that. But I really encourage people to like don't look for stuff that is being elevated and look for stuff that is underground and look for stuff that is being independently produced, because it's always happening. And like I said, it's pumping out some really, really good things, but it's stuff you have to actively seek out.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like what I was trying to point out was that there's still like enthusiasm on the writer's side to continue to put stuff out there from a variety of identities and groups and folks. And there's enthusiasm, but like larger market trends, I think do indicate a retrenchment. I agree with you, Briana.
Oh yeah, there is so much enthusiasm, even with audiences. Like Sinners was one of the biggest movies of the year.
One of the biggest movies ever.
Mm-hmm. So I think with audiences, like they aren't given enough credit by the people who are kind of controlling the reins of like what gets uplifted more and like what gets financed more, because like audiences I think are really hungry for more things and more perspectives, but it's just what actually gets seen that is tough.
What do you think that queer and BIPOC horror can do that no other genre or shading of genre achieve?
Yeah, for mine, I have talked with this with Kailee quite frequently, and the more I have talked about it, the more I want to double down on my idea that I don't even find horror to be a genre as much as I just find it to be a lens of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about like redirecting what lens you are seeing something through. And I really value horror from marginalized perspectives, like for exactly that reason. Like it is marginalized. It's not a perspective we get that much. And when we are talking about things that are horrific or scary or dread inducing or disgust inducing or any of this stuff, there's so much room for like catharsis for marginalized writers and creators to like finally get an audience to understand what about their own experience and perspective is scary. And there's a bunch of like empathy or sympathy to be had from the audience standpoint of, oh, somebody also finds this thing scary. Somebody also sees the horror in this situation. So I think in like a loose genre that relies so much on finding the fear in something that isn't inherently scary, the more perspectives, the better. And I think marginalized people are tapping into that very, very well.
I think for me, there's just a really strong specificity in queer and BIPOC horror. And for better or for worse, I think kind of right now, unfortunately for worse, it often relates so deeply to what we're going through like in our nation. In the United States as well, in a way that is like really can be really intense and really palpable and powerful. For me, as like an Asian person, a non-Black person, I've never really, at the time, I had never really thought about like violence from the police. So that scene in Get Out, if you recall at the end where his friend drives up in a police cruiser and there's this moment of like fear, but then recognition, that was for me a window into an experience that I had never known before. And I think these are all ways that we can I don't want to say develop or provoke empathy because it's always about the person's response to the work. If people read my work and understand a little bit more about what it's like to be queer or Asian in Nebraska, that's great. If they don't, that's their choice to not engage with that. But at the same time, I do think there's ways in which these fears and horrors are like literally coming true for some people. I mean, right now there's a huge amount of anxiety in the adoption community about denaturalization. And even some adoptees who were not secured citizenship upon adoption have been deported. So these concerns about like immigration and being seen as a real American or a real citizen that some people might not have because of how they look, these are present in my work and in the works of other adoptees.
We've set the table talking about queer and BIPOC, intersectionality, and horror. Now I want you guys to just unload all of your favorite films, books, TV shows, operas, everything you think that we should know.
All right. I will let Kailee cover the operas because I know like one and she knows way more than I do.
Yeah, it would be pretty wild if you took the opera category.
Yeah, looking to get into more books. Some of my like favorites, like modern still working authors right now, fall under like the non-binary and BIPOC horror or non-binary and BIPOC speculative fiction category. So those people like Joel Gomez, she wrote the Gilda stories a while ago and is coming out with a sequel where it's like queer Black vampire fiction, and I am obsessed with vampires and I love it. There's River Solomon, who writes a bunch of sci-fi and a bunch of horror and a bunch of horror-tinged sci-fi and sci-fi-tinged horror stuff. And let's see, there's Cassandra Kaw, who writes very, very like short novellas that I think are super accessible. What is it called? It's The Salt Grows Heavy, I believe. Is like killer mermaids hanging out with a Frankenstein monster, like resurrecting people. So all of their work is crazy and I love it. So if you're looking to get more specifically into non-binary BIPOC horror, like obviously look at mine because I am also in that, but those authors as well are doing great work and they are still putting things out. With like some of them having stuff coming out like next year, I believe.
I'll go through some of the films that we talked about previously. So stuff that we love, Briana and I both love Cure by Koshi Kurosawa, Memories of Murder by Bong Joon-ho, Mulholland Drive, which isn't by a queer author as far as I know, but there is a queer storyline within it. But David Lynch is, as far as I know, not a queer director. And then also we wrote down Nope by Jordan Peele. I saw the TV Glow, which is by, I think their first name is Jane Schonbrun. An amazing horror film that I recently watched. It's really great cinematography, so highly recommend. And then I also really enjoyed recently Noroi the Curse, which is Japanese found footage. In terms of operas, so there are a lot of like queer opera composers. I would say two of them that wrote some really excellent Gothic operas include Benjamin Britten, who adapted The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, that extremely famous novella, which also was adapted by Netflix into The House of Bly Manor. That's an opera. And there's also Samuel Barber's Vanessa, which is a Gothic opera about a woman trapped in a house whose former lover returns after 20 years and things do not go well from there. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I'd like to highlight in terms of operas. Not queer or BIPOC, but Jewish. Bernard Herrmann's adaptation of Wuthering Heights. I'll be singing from that later, actually. So I've just been on a really big Bernard Herrmann kick. You may actually know him better for doing the scores to Psycho and other Hitchcock films. Mm-hmm. So he was very famous for that, and Citizen Kane. So he's most famous for his film work. Trying to think if there's anything else that is more recent, kind of blanking here. And then also for TV, we really liked Interview with the Vampire, the remake, and The Fall of the House of Usher on Netflix.
All right, Briana, what are you working on next?
So right now, my debut horror novel, Indigent, is coming out in March, and it's available for pre-orders now. So if you like cannibalism and gentrification metaphors, you can pre-order that one. Right now, I am a little bit more in the film side of things right now because one of my shorts is in post, where it is not horror at all. It's historical family drama fiction about like the civil rights era. So
Wow.
a very different thing. But that is in post, and I'm very much looking forward to it. It made my husband cry, so hopefully it makes other people cry too when it goes to film festivals. And I am in the process of drafting 2 books right now that will hopefully come out next year. One of them is a sci-fi short story collection with a bunch of dystopian themes because that is my bag. And another one is a full dystopian speculative fiction novel that's set in like the alternative 90s. So a bunch of 90s nostalgia and horrific dystopian imagery. So look forward to that.
Fantastic. Kailee, what are you cooking up?
Yeah, I've got my August 2026 release of The Minimalist with St. Martin's Press. It is a gruesome psychological drama for fans of Tar and the Piano Teacher that is a darkly lucid portrait of a classical composer's descent into madness with themes of Asian American adoption issues, Jewish and queer composers of the 20th century, and probably way more about opera than anyone ever needed to know. So if that interests anybody, please feel free to pick up a copy. And then I'm currently writing a Western. I'm hoping to finish this year, a historical novel centered around 3 generations of a Chinese American family out West, spanning about 1860 to 1910. And then after that, I don't know. I'm kind of between either doing sci-fi or like something involving whales.
That's awesome. Where can our listeners find you online?
So you can find me on my author website, where I also offer like developmental editing for books and for scripts. That's just Briana N Cox Writer.com. You can also find me on Instagram or Threads on @PedroParo2, where I do a bunch of book recs. So if I just like blew through these recommendations today and you don't know what I said, you can find all of those recs and like 1,000 more on my Threads account.
Oh, cool. So I will link to that, and I'll also put a pre-order link for your book in the show notes. Kailee, where can our listeners find you online?
My website, KaileePedersen.com, has links to all of my social media. I would say I'm probably most active on Instagram, which is Kailee_Pedersen.
Fantastic. Well, Kailee, good luck with your upcoming opera, and thank you both for chatting with us today about queer and BIPOC horror.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and follow. We're now on YouTube. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link for my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.